Before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss amazing stories like this one. Now, let's dive into a tale that will leave you speechless. The conference room fell silent as Captain Rebecca Hayes walked through the door. She wore her dress uniform with quiet confidence, her posture straight and professional. The Navy Veterans Association had invited her to speak about her service, but the moment she introduced herself as a former Navy SEAL, whispers started spreading through the crowd like wildfire. A man in the third row stood up abruptly. His face was red with anger, and his voice boomed across the room. His name was Gerald Thompson, a retired Navy officer who had served for 30 years. He pointed his finger at Rebecca and declared that she was lying. Women weren't allowed in SEAL training until recently, he shouted. She was too young to have been part of the program. She was dishonoring real SEALs with her false claims. Other veterans began nodding in agreement. Some crossed their arms and stared at her with suspicion. A few pulled out their phones, ready to record what they believed would be an exposure of a fraud. Rebecca stood at the podium, her hands gripping the sides as she took a deep breath. She had faced this reaction before, but it never got easier. The organization's coordinator tried to calm everyone down, but the damage was done. The room was divided now. Half the audience seemed ready to walk out in protest, while others waited to hear what Rebecca would say in her defense. She could feel dozens of eyes judging her, questioning her, doubting every word she was about to speak. Rebecca had known this moment would come eventually. She had lived with the secret of her service for years, unable to share the full truth due to classification levels that most people would never understand. Her missions had been buried in files that few people had clearance to read. The operations she participated in were never reported in newspapers or celebrated in public ceremonies. She looked around the room and saw the faces of men who had served honorably. She understood their skepticism. The Navy SEAL community was small and protective of its legacy. Imposters had tried to claim the trident before, and real veterans had every right to be angry about stolen valor. But Rebecca wasn't one of those imposters. She had earned her place through blood, sweat, and sacrifices that still haunted her dreams. Gerald Thompson wasn't finished. He walked closer to the front, his voice getting louder with each step. He demanded proof. He wanted to see her training records, her deployment papers, anything that would validate her claims. Other voices joined his, creating a chorus of doubt that filled every corner of the room. Rebecca remained calm, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She knew that standard documentation wouldn't be enough for these men. They wanted something more, something undeniable, and she wasn't sure if she could give it to them without breaking the rules that had governed her silence for so long. Rebecca decided to speak despite the hostile atmosphere. Her voice was steady and clear as she began to tell her story. She explained that she had joined the Navy at 19 years old, driven by a desire to serve her country in the most meaningful way possible. She had always been an athlete, pushing her body to its limits through swimming, running, and strength training. When the opportunity came to try for the SEALs, she took it without hesitation. The training was more brutal than anything she could have imagined. She woke up before dawn every day, her muscles screaming in protest. She swam through freezing ocean waters until her lips turned blue. She carried boats over her head until her shoulders felt like they would separate from her body. She endured Hell Week, those infamous 5 days where trainees got less than 4 hours of sleep total while performing constant physical evolutions. But the crowd wasn't listening with open. Gerald Thompson interrupted her again, this time with specific questions designed to trip her up. He asked about training procedures, about specific locations, about the names of instructors. Rebecca answered each question correctly, her responses detailed and accurate. She described the obstacle course at Coronado, the cold waters of the Pacific during night swims, the sand that got into everything and rubbed skin raw. Still, it wasn't enough. Another veteran stood up and accused her of simply researching information online. Anyone could read about SEAL training on the internet, he argued. That didn't prove she had actually been there. The crowd grew more agitated. Some people started gathering their belongings, preparing to leave in disgust. They felt insulted that someone would come to their organization and tell what they believed were lies. Rebecca felt a wave of frustration wash over her. She had given years of her life to serve in silence. She had missed birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings. She had watched friends die in operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. She had carried physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. And now, she stood in front of people who refused to believe that her service had even existed. The coordinator stepped forward and asked if Rebecca had any documentation she could show. Rebecca explained that most of her service records were classified. The operations she participated in were sensitive, involving intelligence gathering and direct action missions in locations that couldn't be disclosed. She had signed non-disclosure agreements that prevented her from sharing specific details about her deployments. This explanation only made things worse. To the skeptical veterans in the room, it sounded like a convenient excuse. Classified records, secret missions, non-disclosure agreements. These were the same excuses that imposters always used when they couldn't provide proof. Gerald Thompson shook his head in disappointment and announced that he had heard enough. He turned to leave, and several others followed his lead. Rebecca stood alone at the podium, watching the room empty. She felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. She had faced enemy combatants, survived dangerous missions, and overcome obstacles that would have broken most people. But she couldn't overcome the simple fact that her service had been so classified that proving it to ordinary civilians was nearly impossible. Just when she thought the situation couldn't get worse, someone in the back of the room made a phone call that would change everything. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up outside the Veterans Center. The remaining people in the conference room noticed the vehicle through the windows, and conversations stopped as everyone watched to see who was arriving. Two men in Navy dress uniforms stepped out first, their movements crisp and professional. Then a third figure emerged. Several veterans in the room immediately stood at attention. Admiral James Morrison was a legend in the Navy community. He had served for over 35 years, leading Special Operations Forces through some of the most challenging periods in recent military history. His chest displayed rows of medals and ribbons that told stories of valor, leadership, and sacrifice. He was known for his integrity and his fierce protection of the SEAL community. If there was one person who would have no tolerance for stolen valor, it was Admiral Morrison. Gerald Thompson's face lit up with vindication. He had been the one who made the call, reaching out to a contact who had connections to the Admiral's office. He was certain that the Admiral had come to expose Rebecca as a fraud. Finally, justice would be served, and this woman would be held accountable for dishonoring the Trident. The Admiral entered the conference room with purpose, his eyes scanning the space before landing on Rebecca. She stood a little straighter, her military bearing automatic after years of service. The Admiral walked toward the front of the room, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Everyone waited to hear what he would say. Gerald Thompson stepped forward eagerly, ready to present his case. He began to explain the situation, telling the Admiral about Rebecca's claims and the lack of evidence she had provided. He listed all the reasons why her story didn't add up, why the timing seemed wrong, why women her age couldn't have possibly been part of SEAL operations during the period she claimed. The Admiral listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When Gerald finished his explanation, the Admiral turned to look at Rebecca again. He studied her for a long moment, and Rebecca met his gaze without flinching. She knew who he was, and she suspected he knew exactly who she was as well. The question was whether he would be able to speak about her service, or whether the same classifications that bound her would bind him. 2. The Admiral took a step closer to Rebecca. The tension in the room was electric, every person leaning forward to hear what would come next. Gerald Thompson crossed his arms with satisfaction, confident that the Admiral would validate his accusations. Other veterans pulled out their phones again, ready to record what they assumed would be a public condemnation. Instead, the Admiral did something unexpected. He extended his hand to Rebecca, and she shook it firmly. The Admiral's voice was clear and authoritative as he addressed the room. He told them that they should all be honored to be in the presence of one of the finest warriors he had ever had the privilege of commanding. He said that Rebecca Hayes had served her country with distinction in operations that most people would never know about. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Gerald Thompson's confident expression crumbled into shock. The Admiral continued speaking, explaining that he couldn't provide specific details about Rebecca's service due to ongoing classification requirements. But he could confirm without any doubt that she had earned her trident and had proven herself repeatedly in combat situations that tested the limits of human endurance and courage. The veterans who had been ready to leave suddenly found themselves frozen in place. Trying to process this stunning reversal, Gerald Thompson wasn't ready to accept what he was hearing. He stepped forward again, his voice shaking with emotion. He asked the Admiral how they could be expected to simply take his word for it. He demanded some kind of proof, something tangible that would validate these extraordinary claims. The Admiral's eyes hardened, and for a moment, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The Admiral asked Rebecca a simple question. He wanted to know if she was willing to show them. Rebecca hesitated, her hand moving unconsciously to her left shoulder. What the Admiral was asking her to reveal was something she had kept hidden for years, even from friends and family. It was personal, meaningful, and connected to memories that were both precious and painful. After a long moment, Rebecca nodded. She reached up and began to unbutton the top of her dress uniform jacket. The room fell completely silent, everyone watching with confusion and curiosity. She slipped the jacket off her shoulders, revealing the white undershirt beneath. Then she turned slightly and pulled the shirt aside to expose her left shoulder blade. There, etched into her skin in dark ink, was a tattoo unlike anything most people in that room had ever seen. It wasn't a standard sealed trident or a common military symbol. It was a specific design that combined elements known only to a select group of operators who had participated in a particular classified program. The tattoo featured a constellation pattern that had meaning to those who had been part of the mission. Along with coordinates that had been burned into the memories of everyone who had been there, the Admiral stepped closer and pointed to specific elements of the tattoo. He explained that this design was given only to members of a specialized task force that was parented in conditions of complete secrecy. The coordinates referenced a location where a critical operation had taken place. An operation that had saved countless lives, but would never be mentioned in any public record. Only a handful of people knew about this tattoo and what it represented. One of the older veterans in the room, a former SEAL named Marcus Chen, suddenly stood up. His eyes were wide with recognition. He had heard rumors about that task force, whispers in the community about operators who had been pulled for extremely sensitive assignments. He had never met anyone who had been part of it, but he had seen a similar tattoo once before on another operator, who had refused to discuss where it came from. The Admiral continued his explanation, carefully avoiding any details that would violate security protocols. He told the room that Rebecca had been selected for this program because of her exceptional skills and her ability to operate in environments where a female operator provided strategic advantages. She had undergone additional training beyond the already intense SEAL preparation. She had participated in missions that required not just physical strength and combat skills, but also intelligence, cultural awareness, and the ability to blend into populations where male operators would stand out. Gerald Thompson sat down heavily in his chair, his face pale. He realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had publicly accused a genuine hero of lying, and he had been completely wrong. Other veterans in the room began to understand as well. The reason Rebecca's service didn't match their expectations wasn't because she was lying, but because her service had been so far beyond normal operations that it existed in a realm most people never knew about. Rebecca pulled her shirt back into place and put her uniform jacket back on. She didn't look triumphant or vindicated. She looked tired, as if reliving these memories had cost her something. The Admiral placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of respect and solidarity. He told the room that they had been privileged to hear even this much, and that they should remember this moment as a lesson in humility and the importance of trusting that there were heroes serving in shadows they would never see. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. Where there had been anger and suspicion, now there was shame and regret. Gerald Thompson stood up slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He walked toward Rebecca with heavy steps, struggling to find the right words. When he reached her, his voice cracked with emotion as he offered his sincerest apology. He explained that he had spent his entire career protecting the integrity of the SEAL community. He had seen too many imposters claim honors they hadn't earned, wearing tridents they hadn't been awarded, telling stories about missions they had never undertaken. His reaction had come from a place of fierce loyalty to his brothers, who had served and sacrificed. But he understood now that his assumptions had been wrong, and he had treated a genuine hero with disrespect she didn't deserve. Rebecca accepted his apology with grace. She told him that she understood his skepticism and that she didn't blame him for doubting her. The SEAL community should protect its legacy, and veterans should question people who make extraordinary claims. Her situation was unique. The secrecy surrounding her service had made it nearly impossible for her to defend herself in normal ways. Other veterans came forward, one by one, to shake Rebecca's hand and offer their own apologies. Marcus Chen, the former SEAL who had recognized the significance of the tattoo, asked if he could buy her a drink later and hear whatever stories she was able to share. A younger veteran, who had been particularly vocal in his doubts, admitted that he had learned an important lesson about jumping to conclusions. The Admiral watched these exchanges with satisfaction. He knew that this moment would ripple through the veteran community. The story would be told and retold, and it would serve as a reminder that service took many forms, some of which remained hidden from public view. He also knew that Rebecca had paid a price for this revelation. She had exposed something deeply personal, and the tattoo that had been her private memorial to fallen comrades was now known to dozens of people. Before leaving, the Admiral addressed the entire room one final time. He spoke about the nature of modern warfare and the evolution of special operations. He explained that the military had learned to adapt to new challenges, that sometimes the best operators for certain missions didn't fit traditional expectations. Women had proven themselves in combat roles across all branches of the military, and some had even excelled in the most demanding special operations. Simon C. emphasized that classification existed for good reasons. It protected ongoing operations, it safeguarded intelligence sources and methods, and it kept enemies from learning about capabilities and tactics. But it also meant that some of the most remarkable stories of courage and sacrifice would never be told. Some heroes would never receive public recognition for their actions. They would serve in silence, and they would carry their experiences privately, finding meaning in the knowledge that their service had mattered, even if no one outside their small community would ever know. The Admiral looked at Rebecca as he spoke these words, and she understood the deeper message. He was acknowledging the burden she carried, the isolation of secret service, the frustration of being unable to share her experiences with people who might understand. He was telling her that she wasn't alone, that others knew what she had done, and that her service was valued even if it couldn't be celebrated publicly. As the Admiral prepared to leave, he pulled Rebecca aside for a private conversation. He asked how she was doing, really doing, beyond the brave face she showed the world. Rebecca admitted that transitioning back to civilian life had been harder than she expected. The missions were over, but the memories remained sharp and vivid. The Admiral listened with understanding. He had seen this struggle in many special operations veterans. The transition from a life of intense purpose and clear missions to the ambiguity of civilian existence was jarring. He gave Rebecca the contact information for resources specifically designed for operators dealing with these challenges. He also told her that she had a community, even if it was scattered and often silent. The people who knew what she had done would always be there for her. After the Admiral left, the event continued in a completely different spirit. Rebecca finally gave her presentation, and this time everyone listened with respect and genuine interest. She spoke about leadership, about overcoming obstacles, about the importance of preparation and teamwork. She carefully avoided any classified details, but she shared enough to give the audience insight into the mindset and discipline required for special operations. During the question and answer session, the questions were thoughtful and respectful. Veterans asked about her training philosophy, about how she maintained mental toughness, about advice she would give to young people considering military service. Rebecca answered honestly, drawing from her experiences, without revealing anything that would violate her security obligations. Gerald Thompson approached her again after the presentation. He asked if she would be willing to come back to speak at future events. He said that her story, even with the limitations on what she could share, was powerful and inspiring. The organization needed voices like hers, perspectives that challenged assumptions and expanded understanding of what service looked like. Rebecca agreed to consider it. She realized that, despite the difficult start, something important had happened in that room. The confrontation had forced her to reveal part of herself that she had kept hidden, but in doing so, she had opened a door to connection with other veterans. She had spent so long protecting her secrets that she had forgotten the value of community in the weeks that followed. Rebecca found herself more comfortable talking about her service. She couldn't share the classified details, and she never would. But she could talk about the principles that had guided her, the values that had sustained her, and the lessons she had learned through her experiences. She began volunteering with veteran organizations, mentoring younger service members, and advocating for better support systems for special operations personnel transitioning to civilian life. The story of what happened at the Veterans Center spread through military networks. Other female special operations veterans reached out to Rebecca, grateful that someone had been willing to stand up and represent their experiences. Some of these women had faced similar skepticism and doubt. They had served in silence, unable to defend themselves against accusations and assumptions. Rebecca's willingness to reveal her tattoo and allow the Admiral to validate her service had created space for other hidden stories to be acknowledged. Even if they couldn't be told in detail, Marcus Chen became a good friend. He understood the unique challenges of readjusting to normal life after special operations. And he had his own struggles with memories that wouldn't fade. They met regularly to talk, sometimes about their experiences, often about ordinary things like sports and books and life's daily challenges. Having someone who understood, who didn't need full explanations because they knew the weight of unspoken experiences, made a significant difference. Rebecca also reconnected with members of her old team, the few she was able to contact. They had scattered across the country, each dealing with their own transition challenges. Some were thriving, others were struggling, but all of them carried the same bond forged through shared danger and shared purpose. They created a private support network, checking in on each other, celebrating successes, and providing support during difficult times. Years later, Rebecca would look back on that day at the Veterans Center as a turning point. The confrontation had been painful and frustrating, but it had forced her out of isolation. It had reminded her that she was part of something larger than herself, a community of warriors who understood sacrifice and service. The tattoo on her shoulder remained a private memorial to her team and their missions, but it had also become a symbol of resilience and the courage required to stand up for truth, even when the world doubted you. She never sought publicity or recognition. Her service remained largely unknown to the general public, protected by the same classifications that had made it so difficult to prove that day. But within the veteran community, her name was spoken with respect. She had shown that heroes came in many forms. She had earned her place among warriors, and no one who truly understood would ever doubt that again.